Dan has just been elected the new president of Romania. In this video, I'm going to explain why this is great news for Ukraine and not so good news for Russia. Privit, or I should probably say Salud, Bună ziua, and welcome to Geopolitics with Connor Klein. Let's get into it. I have spent a little bit of time in Romania, and when you think back to late 2024, we had the first attempt by the Romanian authorities to run this election. That attempt ended up being mired in controversy and ultimately cancelled by the Romanian Constitutional Court. In the first run of the election, Călin Georgescu, an openly pro-Moscow candidate, came from nowhere to be in the lead in the first round of voting. Romania, they hold a open first round of voting, and then the top two candidates go to a second round if there is no candidate that gets 50% plus one in that first round. So Călin Georgescu was in pole position. He was in a runoff against Elena Lascon, and she was pro-Ukrainian. However, that election was cancelled, and Călin Georgescu was banned from running with allegations of irregularities in terms of financing and also supporting fascism, and there were some other charges, and he is currently under investigation and banned from the electoral process. As a result, a candidate who had been expected to go into the second round originally but never made it into the top two, George Simeon of the Our Party, that means gold in Romanian. It also is an acronym that stands for the Alliance for the Unity of Romanians. It's seen as populist, maybe even far-right party, pretty favorable with a lot of the aims of the Kremlin, although I wouldn't personally describe it as actually pro-Russian because they have a bit of a clash, because Our is a irredentist party. It wants to unite Romania with Moldova and other parts of the region where there are some Romanian speakers, parts of Ukraine, and George Simeon is actually banned from entering Moldova and Ukraine. So I would say that he's more we could say an anti-Ukraine candidate, an anti-Moldova candidate, rather than specifically a pro-Russian candidate, because Russia also wants that territory. So if Russia were to see him being elected, then they may also have a clash with such a candidate. However, on balance, because he is against supporting Ukraine militarily and also a lot with trade, maybe not quite as extreme as Călin Georgescu was, or was openly pro-Moscow in the first round, because of those nuances, would have been seen to have played to the Kremlin's favor if he had won the election. Also, you got to remember that there are several leaders in countries that border Ukraine, like Viktor Orban in Hungary, also Robert Fico in Slovakia, that are also against supporting Ukraine. And Russia has tried to play to more nationalist parts of those societies to say, hey, maybe you should also take parts of Ukraine. And if you have irredentist parties like Our coming to power in Romania, that creates a major geopolitical problem for Romania. Viktor Orban, not as outspoken about irredentism, however, he has championed the cause of Hungarian communities outside the country, also been seen wearing a scarf with a Greater Hungary emblem on it that includes parts of Ukraine as well. Same thing in Poland. There isn't actually a party that will be a serious contender for now that would be irredentist. However, there are smaller parties that are suspected of being supported by the Kremlin that do push that narrative. So they would see that as an alliance to destroy Ukraine. So definitely Simeon, if he had won the election, if Our won, would have caused a geopolitical headache for Kyiv, both in the short term in terms of getting military, financial, and logistical support from Romania, but also in the long run in terms of a possible collusion between Russia and several of these more nationalist, populist, and irredentist parties in Europe if they were to come to power on Ukraine's borders. That could cause a major problem for the survival of Ukraine even in the future. So that has been averted. Dan won the election. He's got about a 7 percentage point lead. I'm just looking at the The votes here, they're not 100% counted, but we're over 99% at this point, and he has a 7 percentage point lead. So basically, he'll probably win 53% to 47. Just a few weeks ago, with the first round of voting, Georgi Simonyan, the anti-Ukraine candidate, we'll call him for simplicity, he came in first position with over 40% of the vote, however, below the 50% plus one threshold. And in the first round, the we'll say pro-Ukrainian candidates, their vote was split. So Dan, running as an independent, he more or less defeated the establishment party very narrowly. So both of those got over 20%. So it was a little bit hard to see who was going to win the second round. Simonyan at the time was expected to be, well, he was the favorite. So people felt that he was going to come first in this election. Also in the polling, it seemed like he had a small advantage. However, they did have presidential debates in a debate in Romania, which Simonyan is not considered to have performed very well. Also, the specter of Simonyan coming to power in Romania spooked a lot of investors and created a feeling of anxiety amongst much of the Romanian population that was a little bit more undecided or was not so motivated to vote in the first round. As a result, the turnout yesterday was particularly high. It was about around 65%. It was up over 10 percentage points from the first round. And that was probably, looking at the results, and we see so much, 7 percentage point win for Dan. That seems to motivate a lot of Romanians to come out and made a very clear direction that they want a pro-EU, pro-NATO, pro-Ukraine policy for the country, and not what Simonyan was offering, which was more or less anti-Ukraine, very Eurosceptic, and probably, although he was saying that he was pro-NATO, but pro-NATO in the Donald Trump sense. He appeared on Ben Shapiro, actually performed very well, I thought, even though he's not on our side, to say in terms of Ukraine. He used a lot of language that would have resonated with MAGA voters in particular. So he's more or less a Trumpist MAGA type of candidate, and he seemed to have been aligned with that spectrum of US politics. That didn't help him very much in the election, it seems, because, well, the diaspora in the US is not very big. He voted overwhelmingly for Dan. He did do very well with the Romanian diaspora in parts of Western Europe, which is quite considerable. So countries like Germany, Italy, Spain, the United Kingdom, where he won, but he didn't win by a huge amount. And as we see overall, with almost all the votes counted, he has lost the election. So good news for Ukraine. We have a pro-Ukrainian president in Romania, so that will keep this country on course for supporting Ukraine going forward. It's a bad day for the Kremlin, even though, as I said, there is a bit of nuance, because I wouldn't describe the political party or Georgi Simonyan as being actually pro-Russian, because they do have this geopolitical clash, which is the fact that they both want to see their countries control parts of their neighbors, or entirely their neighbor in Moldova's case, with respect to our. So it is a bit nuanced, the situation. However, definitely the Kremlin would have wanted to see, just geopolitically, that Georgi Simonyan winning the election, because it would have weakened the support in the short run for Ukraine and created this geopolitical headache for both the European Union and Ukraine with respect to political parties that maybe are irredentist plus Eurosceptic, and that would have weakened European solidarity, support for Ukraine, and in general standing up to Russia. So good day for those who support Ukraine. Mulțumesc, Romania. And there you go. That is today's video. Drop your comments down below if you've been following the Romanian elections, what you think all this means for both Ukraine and Russia and the course of the Russo-Ukrainian war. And it is interesting that political candidates that we've seen that have been associated with Donald Trump since he got elected for the second time. So we'll take the example in Canada, where Carney won the election despite his party being way behind in the polling just months before their elections. And it seems that his rival from the Conservatives, who had, he had Canada First slogan, very similar to Donald Trump, that seemed to hurt him. And we saw also in the Australian elections a candidate that was openly very warm to Donald Trump, also performing poorly. Here we see yet again that Giorgio Simenon, who was, as I said, on Ben Shapiro and performed very well on the show in terms of his language, mirroring that of the MAGA movement. Also underperformed compared to expectations just 2 weeks ago. And there is an election that we saw the first round in Poland in the new presidential elections, where the PIS candidate is maybe not quite as openly a Trumpist, but still in that kind of alliance that mirrors a lot of the MAGA language and connections, and he finished in second place. So it's unclear what's going to happen in Poland. However, there seems to be a trend that political candidates that are tying themselves a little bit closer to Donald Trump and the MAGA movement in general are underperforming compared to expectations since Donald Trump returned as the US president. A lot of his policies, of course, that I've discussed in this channel, aren't seen particularly well in Europe, like imposing all these tariffs and his treatment of Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office, for example, and in general, his policy with respect to the war in Gaza. So on that point, I'll say la revedere. Once again, merci Romania, and drop your comments down below in the comment section. Ciao, ciao.